Hello, everyone. Hope everyone's having a great Thanksgiving weekend. We had a wonderful family get together yesterday and even was able to FaceTime my daughter out in Texas. So all is good with the world. Also, I'll share with y'all, I'm not going to share this on True Social. Um, my youngest daughter announced to everyone that she's pregnant. She's my first grade school teacher, and we're just ecstatic, very thankful. It will be my first grandbaby, so definitely looking forward to that, and, I'm beaming with a huge big smile as a result of it, so and then we have to talk about the crap. Let me get my computer down just a little bit. I also got my new headphones in on Wednesday. They match my glasses. So, anyway, we're going to get started on chapter 3 today, organized crime and the state of Israel. This is a very interesting um, ch- chapter, very important in setting the foundation for organized crime in general, and how it fits into Operation Gladio. You will see a couple of direct references, although, again, most authors don't know about it, so they don't use the term. So this starts in talking about the obituary that was written for Sam Brockman in the New York Times. And it mentions in there that he helped fund weapons for the troops of the Haganah, which happens to be a Zionist organization that was set up in 1920. And it was used, basically, some call it more of a terrorist organization in scaring off Palestinians of all religions. And because it's a translation of the word defense, it basically transitions in 1948 into the IDF, which is the Israeli Defense Forces. So the Haganah, whenever you hear that, is the um, origination of the IDF. And I also made a note when I was doing my other research on Zionism that it was created basically, or funded, it's probably a better word, by the Jewish Agency, which is a subordinate organization to the World Zionist Organization, the WZO, which I talk about on my Substack. And they got quite a bit of funding for the from the Jewish agencies, in particular from Poland and Canada, to and one of their major focuses was after World War One, when the League of Nations set up basically the UK's oversight of the creation of a Jewish homeland, because at the time it was not called Israel. Um, the UK put very specific limitations on immigration because they didn't want a full out war going on down there. They wanted to kind of over time sneak them in the back door, if you will. Very limited but consistent flow of immigrants, i.e., Jewish people. And the Haganah fought against them routinely, on the ground in Palestine, in basically implementing a um, massive immigration into Palestine of Jewish um, people that far and exceeded what the UK in because they had basic jurisdiction over it based on the League of Nations at the time, and the Haganah didn't want to have any limitations placed on it. So I just wanted to put that out there up front for some additional context of this chapter. Um, there was a book written called The Brahman Dynasty, and it's quoted as saying, quote, that Sam, quote, personally underwrote life insurance policies on Canadian pilots recruited to help fight in Israel in the 1948 War of Independence, unquote. So you have basically Brahman acknowledging the fact that he funded secret weapons purchases for the Haganah, as did many prominent Jewish people around the world. He is known to have funded at least $2 million worth of weapons to Israel during that time frame. Um, the he also was a head of the Canadian Jewish Congress, and if those of you who have read my Zionism article, many of the different countries with significant portions of Jewish populations had a Congress that reported to the World Zionist Organization. So he was the leader of the Canadian section of that. So they believed in quiet manipulation as opposed to being on the forefront of their advocacy on issues like this. So he was aiding the Zionist paramilitary group called the Haganah. And the British, who until 1948 had controlled the mandatory Palestine according to the treaties, would say when the British mandate ended in 1958 that the Israelis, because of all of this funding that had um, flowed in over the last 20 years, immediately declared war on many of the surrounding Arab forces. And they were very well equipped from all of these donated resources. So the Jewish Agency was set up right after World War I under the leadership of David Ben-Gurion, and you'll recognize that name because he eventually becomes Prime Minister of Israel. It, for a time, after the establishment of Israel and the creation of the IDF, kind of loses its way, but in 1970, which we'll talk about a little later, Les Wexner, Jeffrey Epstein's partner, uses a guy by the name of Max Fisher, who basically regenerates the Jewish agency and uses it as part of what we will later see a significant issue, or operation is probably a better word. So, Major General Charles Wingate of the British military was dispatched in the early days and worked closely with the Haganah from the British government. Wingate even organized joint British Army Zionist paramilitary commando units that patrolled and suppressed Arab elements in the region. They were called Special Night Squads. If that sounds familiar, that's because those are under the auspices of the characteristics of Gladio units. In 1945, the Haganah began an effort to stockpile weapons, munitions, aircraft, non lethal supplies, tools from all around the world. A fellow Zionist by the name of Rudolph Sonneborn, Sonneborn, basically began construction of Jewish villages on behalf of the World Zionist Organization. Under his leadership, 18 or so Jewish millionaires and billionaires were recruited to bankroll these new Jewish villages. It was called the Sonneborn Institute. The institute was a collective of Zionist millionaires and billionaires that supported Zionist causes. It would later become a model for an organization called the Mega Group, which was founded by Les Wexner and Charles Brockman in 1991. The Sonneborn Institute's chief asset was a Haganah operative called Yeda Yedua Arazi. It's Yehuda, last name Arazi. During World War II, he was a soldier in the Jewish Brigade. Its fighters from the immigrant population living in mandatory Palestine. By 1945, he was basically a gun runner. He was actively smuggling arms for Haganah into Palestine from Europe in 1938, which is at the very beginning of the war. And we've discovered as part of Gladio, we know that in every military effort, there is a skimming off of weaponry that goes to the black market. And what they're describing here is basically that exact same thing. So we're conducting World War II while at the same time skimming off weapons to send to Israel. So another author wrote that one of Arisi's associates by the name of Leonard Weissman, who probably was a member of the Sonneborn group, was 34 years old from Pittsburgh. His business included Materials Redistribution Company, which basically was a scrap metal company. And he basically used fictitious companies that existed only on paper to assist the purchase and illegal exports of arms from the United States to Israel. Again, the whole skimming. So the front companies were organized by a guy by the name of Nahum Bernstein, an attorney in New York City that was used to source weapons that were constructed from spare parts and export them overseas. Bernstein's name can be found on corporate registrations of firms like Machinery Processing and Converting Company. So basically, there's another company called OVED Trading Company, and that one was used to transport explosives. So we know that during the course of wars that these people get us into, that there's about 10 to 20 other things happening all at the same time that we don't pay attention to because we're supposedly focusing on a war with all of their propaganda at one um, way, while all of these other side operations are happening. And so basically, in more than one way, we supplied a lot of weaponry to Israel pre-Israel. So some other companies, just for y'all's research, Materials for Palestine, Inland Machinery and Metal Company, the Eastern Development Company, all companies that were involved in this. Materials for Palestine was listed as a charity, while Inland Machinery actively shipped armaments and lethal munitions. Eastern Development exported legal, non military goods and machinery, as quote unquote relief supplies. There's even a possibility that Paul Helliwell, who is a Gladio operator, was associated to the Eastern Development Company. He is listed as an attorney for a company called Eastern Development Corporation that was located in Miami, along with several of his other companies. And one of the guys that he dealt with a lot, Leonard Weissman, that was a member of that Soborn group, was also from Pittsburgh, which is where this company is located. So there's kind of a little circle there that by um, wouldn't take a big leap of assumption there to connect all of them. The role of organized crime in covertly arming the Haganah is well documented. So now we're going to bring in the Meyer Lanskys. So you have Arisi, who forged ties with Lansky in creating maritime companies for shipping. And of course, we know from our previous research that Lansky basically ran the docks in New York City. So getting things onto ships would not have been a big deal. So Whitney mentions Albert Anastasia and Joe Adonis as two of the people that were associated with the Longshoremen Union that was part of this organized effort. And along with Meyer Lansky, helped Israeli agents conceal arms purchases for Israel while arms bound for Egypt mysteriously fell overboard. Lansky's associate Bugsy Siegel met with a Reuven Defney, a representative of Haganah looking to raise funds. They told Siegel that the Zionists were looking to unshackle themselves from British rule, and the path to do so was to fight. So the Haganah would receive suitcases filled with $5 and $10 bills, $50,000 in all, on this one effort to support that. So another guy in Lansky's mobster world was Joseph Bayonne Joe Ziccarelli. Ziccarelli was alleged to have been involved in also involved in arms trafficking and munitions that were sold to Israel. His usually would go via Cuba, Mexico, Venezuela, or the Dominican Republic on their way to Nicaragua. And one interesting element about all of those countries is all of them had components of Gladio in them. So Ciccarelli was friends with Carmine Galanti, who was a big player in mafia families and also was one of Roy Cohn's main clients in the criminal underworld. So she goes on and talks about a feud between them and how there was some uh, ruffling of feathers with the Canadian wing of the French Connection. And we'll talk more extensively about the crime families in Canada along with the Brofmans in another chapter. But it's important to understand because the French Connection in Canada went hand in hand with the Corsican mafia that we talked about in the uh, previous book and their elimination by Richard Nixon, for lack of a better word, in the 1970s. So um, I'm just trying to paint the picture that all of these books overlie each other without them realizing they're all talking about the same thing. He was suicided. That's a very common thread through all of this as well. Okay. So Zeccarelli had both legitimate and quasi-legitimate, businesses like Abco Vending, which is a cigarette vending machine. Um, Along with him was Irvin Schwartz, who would later become infamous in 1970 for his involvement in the stock manipulation schemes. Schwartz um, represented the Galante Ziccarelli interest in arms trafficking, stocks and securities, and cigarette vending machines. So that's just crazy. Um, but again, you have to have the legitimate business to launder the illegitimate business money through. So that kind of makes sense. Adolf Schwimmer was the founder of Israel's aircraft industries, one of the country's great military contractors, known as today as Israel Aerospace Industries. I've heard a lot about them. In the 1930s, he worked for Lockheed and TWA. After World War II broke out, he was affiliated with U.S. Air Transport Command, which is out of Scott Air Force Base. It's now called Air Mobility Command. So they basically just contract all of the. If you're just so that y'all know this, if you own aircraft in the United States, there's a program called CRAF, CRAF, that's Civil Reserve Aviation Fleet, that you basically, in order to get services from the FAA, you have to register your aircraft to be basically commandeered during wartime. We've used that program extensively, and it's ran out of Scott Air Force Base at Air Mobility Command or US Transcom now as the joint part of it. And so saying that they had business with it would only mean at a bare minimum that because you have those aircraft, they can be commandeered by the government at any time. So that may or may not mean anything. So, he emerged as a key player on the Israeli side of the Iran-Contra affair, which we go into a lot more later. Um, he was the individual who conceived of the arms for hostages plot that, featured Oliver North. Let's see, Israel's richest man, Shoal Eisenberg, was also, um, part of this underbelly. It was Eisenberg's Israel Aerospace Industries that would have close ties to Israel's intelligence, and he hired most of his company staff from the Israel intelligence entities. So Swimmer worked very closely with a guy by the name of Schindler, Irvin Swifty Schindler. They all have their mafia names. Schindler owned air freight company called Air Service. So that's like Air America, I guess. Mossad copying us. Swimmer relocated to California with funds from the Haganah. Swimmer and Schindler utilized the company by means of acquiring aircraft and aircraft parts to be shipped back to Palestine. An embargo was in place due to President Truman's claim of neutrality, but that didn't stop them. They basically were shipping them through all kinds of cutout countries, like to Panama, and then they would ship them further from there. So they basically were working around everything. And then she mentions that we'll talk about Iran Contra in chapter 7. Um, Haganah uh, had was supplying arms to the Zionist forces in Palestine, and there were other countries that had similar setups uh, besides the United States. One particular important anti-communist force that was collaborating with Haganah was from the Somoza region of Nicaragua, and of course, we know they had Gladio. And the fact that they label them anti-communist forces, that tells you they were Gladio stay behind units. So she is acknowledging here without using the words that the network of Gladio following World War II that was put in all of these countries to include South America was aiding the Zionist effort, which I find fascinating. The special relationship between the Zionist cause and Nicaragua was largely due to the presence of United Fruit. And of course, we know there because that's the Rockefeller organization that bought up um, a lot of the land down there and was not paying taxes. And I think in that particular case, it was in Guatemala, but they are represented through many of the Latin America countries. They United Fruit, she goes on and points out that they were under the basically um, the CIA activities there, um, and that United Fruit had fallen under the control of Samuel Zemurray, who also owned a separate fruit company down there that was a favorite on Wall Street to Lehman's and Goldman Sachs. And so they Zemurray was also a big backer of Zionist causes. He aided arms supplies to the Haganah. He eventually acquired the SS Exodus, a steamship to ferry refugees to Palestine in 1946. United Fruit became United Brands that were tied to all kinds of Black World intel operations. Its leadership would include members of Leslie Wexner's inner circle and two main mentors, Max Fisher and a guy by the name of A. Alfred Taubman, Taubman. So in 1947, Truman's embargo began to be enforced, and Nicaragua started providing arms to Haganah. And again, a lot of them probably still came from the United States. It was just through cutouts that they end up in Nicaragua to come here. And also, um, you notice this is kind of the precursor for the Iran Contra because you've got Nicaragua being the staging point, which is what ends up happening in the Iran Contra. They already had the precursor set up with all of the contacts in the late 1940s to pull off what they pulled off in the Iran Contra. And most of us were dumb to the whole thing. The relationship between Haganah and Latin America wasn't solely under Zamuri and United Fruit. There were also other officers that used Sam Kay, a Florida businessman and real estate developer who had tons of contacts in Panama, Batista's Cuba, and elsewhere. FBI files show that Kay was a reputed international gangster with close business ties to the Miami Beach hotel of Morris Landberg, who was himself a frontman for Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky running everything. The Zionist interests melded in with organized crime and real estate ventures, casino operations, and slush funds. So, a guy by the name of Tibor Tibor Rosenbaum became a hero for the resistance through his activities on behalf of the Jewish people. Um, in one instance, he posed as a high ranking Nazi officer and entered a concentration camp and was able to secure the release of 30 prisoners. So Rosenbaum, was also part of the World Zionist Congress, set up a Geneva bank called the International Credit Bank, ICB. The ICB moved money for Mossad and the Ministry of Defense, the IDF. The British Sunday Times would report that in 1975, as much as 90% of the IDF's external budget flowed through Rosenbaum's bank. It also moved money for organized crime. In an expose in Life magazine, it fingered ICB Bank as a recipient of large money skimmed off from mob operations from casinos in Las Vegas, the Caribbean, and elsewhere. So that's another one of those, and it's in Geneva, Switzerland, alongside many other banks that have been used for money laundering. So a lot of Meyer Lansky's money was there. Um, Two offshore banks that was used was the Bank of World Commerce and the Atlas Bank. And we've talked about the Atlas Bank in several of these books as it related to laundering Gladio money, like for drugs to buy weapons for the Gladio units. So again, another thing in common with these networks is where they choose to launder their money, which makes sense because this is an Intel CIA slash Mossad slash MI5 6. Those guys all are using the same money laundering entities. So the fact that the blackmail portion of all of this is laid on top of that should surprise no one. So the organizers of Atlas on behalf of the ICB was Sylvain Ferdman, Ferdmann. In the expose in Life magazine, they refer to him as a Swiss citizen who was an international banker slash economist. The US considered him a fugitive accused of interfering with federal inquiry and skimming rackets, mafia. So it's always, and she does a great job of pointing out who sits on the boards of these banks and these companies because there's overlap. The ICB itself was on the board of the ICB was Ed Levinson and John Pullman. Levinson was a partner with Lansky in the Miami International Airport Hotel and the ran with Clifford Jones, the lieutenant governor of Nevada, between 47 and 54, and was also an alleged associate of Meyer Lansky. Sitting alongside Levinson was John Pullman, Lansky's personal financial advisor. Now, let me explain to you how important that is. Lansky was considered the financial advisor to the entire committee of Lucky Luciana's mafia entity, which included both the Jewish and the Italian mob in all of the United States. So the financial advisor to the financial advisor, that's a big deal. Okay. So Pullman was close to a guy by the name of Lou Chesler, having become acquainted with the Canadian businessman in the 1940s. He introduced Chesler into Lansky's orbit. Chancellor began managing Lansky's interest in the Bahamas, including his hotels and casinos. Pullman was organizing the Bank of World Commerce, the partner bank to Atlas Bank, and a corresponding bank to the ICB. And it's also interesting to note that in the Bahamas is where Castle Bank was set up by the Helliwell and used both by these people and the Gladio network, if they're even separate. Levinson and Pullman also sat on the board of BWC. An IRS report says that BWC is the Bank of World Commerce. So you have the same people sitting on both banks, basically. And it says that the IRS said that it was set up to maintain a liquid supply of funds to be used for setting up new gambling casinos in the Caribbean. Another guy that was on the board, Benjamin Siegelbaum, a money courier for Lansky, very big in the crime family. He held posts, Siegelbaum did, on the Exchange and Investment Bank, another Geneva bank, and let's see, the Exchange and Investment Bank was Lansky's preferred financial institute. So his Lansky's role in the Exchange and Investment Bank was accidentally exposed by Chase Manhattan when this occurred after the bank found two of their employees using accounts to hide embezzled funds. It was at that point that Lansky shifted the bulk of his business to Rosenbaum's bank. Crazy. Oh, got found out. I'm just going to move all my money to this other illegitimate bank. Siegelbaum dabbled in Florida real estate um, under a company called Major Realty. Um, he that was co-founded by a guy by the name of Max Orovitz, Orovitz, and he was well, he's referred to as a legitimate businessman and an honored Jewish philanthropist, but no stranger to criminals. So basically, he was their money laundering entity. And I found when I was doing research on the oligarchs in Ukraine, I found the Jewish ones. I found a lot of them use people that they find through Jewish community service organizations that are also realtors um, to launder their money into legitimate real estate purposes. And so there's, and I know this isn't going to come out right, but there's some benefit that they find to using fellow Jewish members for their illegal activities as if it's assumed they're not going to ask questions about where you got your money. And when you have someone in some of the cases that has no legitimate job and they're buying millions of dollars worth of real estate, at some point you have to scratch your head and say, what's going on here? But that doesn't seem to be the case. So, um, Orovich was partnered with a guy by the name of Lou Chesler in both Florida real estate companies. General Development Company was Chesler's, and they did development projects in the Bahamas that ultimately spawned Resorts International. And remember, Resorts International came from Mary Carter Paints, which was connected to Governor Thomas Dewey and Paul Helliwell's Castle Bank in the Bahamas. One nice little circle there. And Paul Helliwell is everywhere in Operation Gladio. So Borovich's organization was referred to as the Miami Group, a circle of organized crime linked Jewish businessmen with holdings across various economic sectors in Florida and in Israel. The Miami Group established Dan Hotels, a luxury hotel chain with locations in Israel and India. Israel's first successful oil drilling company, Israel Oil Ventures, was set up by this group. Israel Oil Ventures expanded its capability in 1960 when it purchased Israel American Oil Corporation with ties to Rimrock Tidelands, a subsidiary of Rimrock Tidelands. Rimrock International was of interest to a Senate investigation into international narcotic traffic. And its director was Santo Sorge, Sorge. And we know about the international narcotics traffic because that's tied directly to Gladio. It was described in the Senate report, one of the most important mafia leaders, the Santo Sorge guy, and a liaison between the American and Sicily mafia clans. So Atlas Bank would eventually become known as Atlas Trust, and it's tied to Geneva money that ends up in the Middle East. There's also another bank called the Intra Bank in Beirut, Lebanon, and it's tied to a Intra Bahama Trust Limited bank. And the Intra Bank in Lebanon was formed by Youssef Beitas, Beidas, a Christian Palestinian refugee from a prominent banking family. Beitas forged agreements with leading American banks, including Bank of America, Chase Manhattan, and then placed branches of Intrabank in the world's important hotspots for money laundering: London, Geneva, and the Caribbean. At home in Lebanon, Intra held 20% of the country's total deposits and over half of all the country's banking assets in Lebanon. Another author said Interest Bank Services was a primary depository for world's leading arms traffickers. They received financing from Lebanese traders for illegal weapon sales for the Arabian Peninsula, uh, um, primarily in Yemen and Aden, Cyprus, Sudan, Nigeria, Rhodesia, South Africa, and Kurdish communities in the Middle East. It was, quote, "a haven for cash for anyone with a balance to hide." US tax evaders, oil rich sheiks, all wanting money for a rainy day revolution. So Intrabank had ties to the CIA and probably every other intel entity. And it transformed Beirut into a hub of the agency's covert operations in the Middle East. So it was a great place to keep money for their use for doing all of their shady, and wait till you hear the people that's involved. So when you several different CIA officers were seen at the bank and used it to handle their checks. The intrabank board of directors included Kamal Adham, who was the head of Saudi intelligence, and a cousin to Aden Khashoggi, who was the Khashoggi guy that was murdered's dad, and he's an illicit arms dealer, big time, one of the biggest there was. Um, and he also was a player in Iran Contra and the BCCI bank affair, and eventual collapse of that bank, which was tied to Operation Gladio. And the congressional report that looked into BCCI said Aden was the CIA's principal liaison for the entire Middle East in the mid 1960s through 79. So for 20 years, um, Aden Khashoggi was the CIA's primary liaison for the entire Middle East. That's huge. Interbank was identified by American law enforcement as a laundromat for global drug trade, located in Lebanon and used by much of the French connection for their laundering of money. So, she goes on to talk about the Corsican, which is the French element of the drug trade, organized crime figures, um, included their government officials, industry officials, and high society cabinet members, police, military, all having something to do with that bank. Um, a guy by the name of Sammy Corey, K Houry, had protection from Israel's James Addy, who was also an agent for the United States Federal Bureau of Narcotics, the precursor to the DEA, who was assigned to the Middle East. He was, let's see, reported that the drug lord had provided thousands of guns to Israel and, quote, provided the contacts and money that enabled Corey to move narcotics across to Europe. So you have government officials working both on the drug side and the intel side via the CIA, working with known cutouts both in Israel and other Middle Eastern countries um, s- in this whole network, arms, drugs. So another figure implicated by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in Lebanon to Europe was banker Edmund Safra, whose connections to BCCI, Iran-Contra, figures like Robert Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein we discuss in Chapter 7. Safra was also a Zionist with strong ties to Israel, and during the 1980s, he served on the board overseeing B'nai B'rith International, seated alongside members like Edgar Brockman and Max Fisher. Now, we've not talked too much about B'nai B'rith, but I've talked with someone who is Jewish and knows about that organization. It's very much to an outsider like Skull and Bones as far as the people that are affiliated with it. I'm just going to leave it at that. So, Zafra, you will remember when we were talking about him, he's the guy that was killed in his house, burned up, and had a U.S. Army um, nurse that basically set the fire. And there were lots of question marks around the whole thing as to who was responsible for his death. But that guy was deeply involved running a bank that was a known money laundering bank for all of this world apparatus. And he obviously got crosswise. He was also tied to the raping and stealing of Russia and the Magnitsky affair. He provided a lot of money for that guy that was over there doing all of that. Um, and so I would not venture to guess who killed him, but somebody he got suicided in a horrible way by being basically burned alive. Um, so let's go on. She talks about how the casinos, and for those of you who haven't watched all my videos, she spends a little bit of time. I'm not going to go into all of the names and everything, tying this intra bank to casinos and to Aiden Khashoggi and Monte Carlo and all of the um, underbellies of how those are all tied together. I will just tell you from my personal experience that the tying of weapons, drugs, um, to casinos, it appears that the casinos provide a perfect opportunity for people to get together and um, do business and be involved in illicit activities. Much of it is caught on tape because some of these places have uh, Intel outfitted rooms that record promiscuous activities that would otherwise be illegal. And They are located in places where they control the government, like in the Bahamas or the Canary Islands or Malta or Bora Bora. And they they basically do a lot of deals at these places. And she goes through an elaborate association of all of these people, all tied to Meyer Lansky, um, in and to the intrabank. Um, let's see, Hagen Haganah's activities in Palestine. Um, so intrabanks, particular um, makes for bankers and organized criminals alike. There is often money to be made on both sides of any conflict, which we found out. Uh, After all, this was a bank, talking about intrabank, that had been founded by someone who had fled the Haganah's activity in Palestine and a casino that, according to Jim Hogan, would siphon money off to finance the PLO. Yet at the same time, Zionist aligned gangsters, bankers, and other figures were caught up in the web. This was a tendency that would grow in the 70s and 80s. Behind the scenes alignment between the ruling elite of Arab societies enriched by petrodollar systems and the Israeli business class and security apparatus. So she's basically making the point that all of these entities were set up outside of the countries like Lebanon, and you have the Israelis in bed with both the Arabian elite funding both sides of every war that is fought in that general area. That's basically her point. And Atlas Bank was one of those entities. Bankers and Tankers, the world of Bruce Rappaport. This guy's a very interesting guy. So when William Casey was Ronald Reagan's director of CIA, he he created a group that basically was referred to as the Hardy Boys that lacked CIA clearances but had their own back door into Langley. And they could go up to Casey's office directly. Among this group was a guy by the name of Max Hugel, Hugel. So he had actually been a deputy director at the CIA, but had got involved in some dubious stock trading and was no longer in the technical employment of the CIA, but still worked for the CIA, which is why they have to have black money when they can't pay you through federal money. So other members included John Shaheen, Robert Anderson. Shaheen was an oil trader that also played a role in an event called the October Surprise Affair, while Robert Anderson's career um, went from being a prominent member of the Eisenhower administration to being disbarred for money laundering in the 1980s. Another one of these important people was Bruce Rappaport. Rappaport left a string of business deals that were mind-numbing, complex, tied to fraud, linked to intelligence entities, and mostly consisted of backroom deals. He had a sophisticated web of shipping companies, banks, oil companies, mines, and other holdings. Rappaport and Casey was sometimes co-participants. They were golfing buddies, made frequent visitors to the Deep Dell Golf Club on Long Island. And one author quotes saying, when Rappaport visited Deep Dell, his chauffeur was often Louis Villardo, an alleged associate of New York City mobsters. He was tied to Russian organized crime, to include the boss of bosses of Russian crime syndicate. He was also and that guy, the Simeon Malakovich, was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, but a buddy of Rappaport's. So it's quite possible Rappaport had introduced Mogilevich, the Russian, to Robert Maxwell in the late 1980s. A key business partner of the Russian facilitated his entry into Israel and US financial systems. So he's also buds with Edmund Safra, the guy that got burned up alive, who was also acquainted with Maxwell and Rappaport. So another little group. Rappaport origins are vague. It's known that he was born in Haifa, Palestine, Haifa, Palestine in 1922, and that his family moved there from Ukraine. Another Ukrainian, another Jewish Ukrainian. He earned a law degree. Um, he was a judge after Israel's founding. He served in the IDF to become a major. Um, he fought in World War II, fighting with the British Army. He was part of the African Auxiliary Pioneer Corps, later called the African Pioneer Corps. He also was a member of the Special Interrogation Group, SIG, the British commando group made up of Jewish volunteers from Mandatory Palestine. The SIG was integral in the Special Night Squad. So basically, he's a Gladio guy. My words. Rappaport joined the 6th Airborne Division, another British Army outfit. He was part of the Airborne Infantry Division that deployed to Palestine in the 1940s and was part of the administration to actually create Israel after the 1948 um, authorization to create it. He helped create Israel's military police. So you got a Gladio guy creating Israel's military police. I'm sure nothing could go wrong there. He also was integral in the criminal enterprises and covert operations. Um, he was involved in some shady activity, saying in the early 1950s, Rappaport and Teddy Kollek, Kollek, became charismatic. Oh, Kollek, who became the charismatic mayor of Jerusalem, devised a scam on construction materials serious enough to produce warrants. So supposedly Rappaport and him were partners, and his brother was also involved in this. Um, and so were the guy that we just talked about, Shimmer, and the Arizi guy. So, and they had to deal with the delivering of aircraft to Israel via South America. So they're all involved in all of this. Um, Kollek's activities put him on the British intel radar. He his phones were bugged, his bags were searched, and he was consistently tracked by MI5, according to an MI5 officer. Um, but a mutual friend by the name of Ben Heron was supposedly an Arctic Bolshevik, would subsequently become the head of an organization that was a centralized body to coordinate Israel's trade unions. Heron's wife, Marion, worked for the SHAI, the intelligence apparatus of the Haganah. So he's in on it from the beginning as well. Rappaport fled Israel. Over the course of his lifetime, he held passports for numerous countries: Panama, Costa Rica, Israel, and Switzerland. The Swiss, um, Rappaport was involved in a Swiss Israel trade bank headquartered in Geneva, because of course he was. And he knew the Swiss Israel's, um, I guess Swiss dash Israel's owner, and provided him with loans. And it is assumed the person that um, was the founder and owner of that particular bank was a guy by the name of Gideon Persky. Gideon was the brother of Shimon Peres, who later became both president and prime minister of the company, or of the country of Israel. And he was also close friends with Robert Maxwell, and later Maxwell's daughter, Isabel. Years later, Ehud Barak, who also was prime minister and the Israel's secretary of defense, alleged that Sharon Perez had been the person who had originally introduced him to Jeffrey Epstein. So she's kind of building this group that's connected to Robert Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein, the Haganahs, the IDF, and all of the senior leadership of Israel for decades. And how the tentacles of each of these people reach back into the mafia, drugs, weapons trafficking. So it's an extensive group. Um, Another person, uh, Yaduda Assia, Assia, that had to do with the banks, the Swiss Israel um, bank that helped prop up Rappaport, um, was actively on the Mossad payroll, but working for this bank. Um, and you have They also had connections to raise money for the construction of nuclear reactors in Israel's covert construction of nuclear weapons. So, a guy by the name of Abner Cohen, who wrote about Israel and the bomb, writes that Ben Gurion and Simone Perez, quote, conducted outs the management of funds outside the official state budget and had enlisted the aid of American Jewish fundraiser and businessman Abraham Feinberg to locate private donors. Feinberg ran American Trust Bank and Trust, a subsidiary of Swiss Israel. So you have an American that's raising money to privately fund the nuclear weapons for Israel. There are other lines running from the Swiss Israel bank that go, um, unsurprisingly, she says, to Honeywell's banking complex. So prior to his operation called Swiss Israel, this Yaduda Asia spent World War II in Thailand, where he met that General Phao, PHAO, that was intricate in Operation Gladios. You remember how we had the cargo office in Thailand where they called and they answered the phone, and it was both the CIA, it was the Thai military, and it was the uh, shipping company. This is the guy, this general, that basically set up the whole Thai apparatus for Operation Gladio and the drug shipments into that. And so this guy is directly tied to the Thai operation set up for Operation Gladio. And we know that Helliwell, who spent time over there, is also so directly related to that. So this guy was in the theater during World War II and all that was going down. In 1960, ASIA was contacted by Irving Davidson, a powerful lobbyist whose clients included the CIA, the Teamsters, Texas oil giant Clinton Murchison, and the state of Israel. So wait a minute. This lobbyist included Israel, CIA, Teamsters, oil, all in one belly whack. So the this Urban Davidson was contacted concerning a Bohemian bank called Guarantee Trust Company, and we've talked about them before too. Guarantee Trust was run by a major supporter of Israel called Abe Multer, Multer, who and was one of the offshore entities that handled laundered money that flowed from the Teamsters pension fund into organized crime. They also handled skim from the mafia casinos. The vice chairman, sorry, of the bank was Leonard Bursten, Bursten, the former director of Miami National Bank. We came across them too. So we talked about Miami National Bank in chapter 1 that had been founded with the aid of a loan from Teamsters Pension Fund and employed the services of Paul Helliwell's law firm. So Helliwell represents the Miami National Bank. Rappaport's empire began to expand in all directions. The process began in 1959 with the creation of an International Maritime Services and International Maritime Supply Company Limited. The latter company, was closely linked to the shipping concerns of a UK called Wilson Limited. That's the name of the company, which was soon joined by a trio of maritime companies called the NS Frank and Zahn, the Maritime the American Maritime Supply Service Inc., based in Chicago, and the Italian Maritime Supply Company. Rappaport noted that the three firms buying into International Maritime, it would be possible that a shipping clientele of 161 firms will cover the entire world. So Rappaport had a lifelong connection to I'm not even going to try to pronounce this. This is a Greek shipping clan, Kulucundis, Kalukandis family. So one of those family members was the co-organizer of International Maritime Supplies, according to court documents. The pair were using the company to run scams and loot the coffers of unsuspecting businesses. That family, that Greek family, advanced their own shipping interests through London and Overseas Freighters, another company, which in time would boast an impressive fleet of tankers for oil trade. In the 1960s, Inter Maritime Supplies owned a stake in London and Overseas Freighters. London and Overseas Freighter was also formed by the same company with their cousins, another Greek family. This other Greek family, Mavroleones, were themselves connected to circles around Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. And isn't that convenient to have a shipping family in your inner circle if you're going to be trafficking young humans? So Jesselyn Maxwell, for years, dated a guy who mother was married to the patriarch of the Mavro-Leone family. That's how close this group is. So, one of the sons can be found in Epstein's Black Book of Contacts. Rappaport set up the institution that would later stand at the center of this complex network of firms and money conduits, Inter Maritime Bank, IMB. It had A and B shareholders, and she goes through a very laborious interaction between who had A's and who had B's, and how much money was on um, uh, invested in each one of them. What all we need to know for our conversation is there's a whole bunch of banks. The State Department knew all about this. So did everybody else in our government. And a lot of people would go to jail as a result of some of this intermixing of money. And they knew that Tiber Rosenbaum and Meyer Lansky was involved in this, and that basically it was a criminal enterprise. So I'm not going to read the details of how much money was put where, but it's interesting to note that Rappaport was heavily invested, um, as well as an OSS veteran by the name of E.P. Barry. And that guy was part of Paul Helliwell's Florida banking network as well. So you have Rappaport in bed with OSS veterans slash CIA operatives and mob people. That's kind of the bottom line. And they're all in bed with Israel too. So it's hard in when we go through this book to know where the US involvement versus Israel's involvement, because in most cases it appears to be a seamlessly integrated network, that there is no differences. So, um, moving on. I'm not going to go through just Rappaport's bad dude. That's what we need to know. Mossad goes to Rome. In 1967, Gershon Perez, the brother of Simone Perez, joins a board called Centro Mondiale Commerciale. It's an Italian subsidy of Permadex. Permadex is going to be talked about throughout this book. We came across it briefly in one of our previous books, but it was a World Trade Center. You know how like we have the World Fair? Well, they got the idea as and basically it was a nefarious intent to set up a permanent location in Basel, and you'll recognize that name, and I'll come back to that in a second. Um, of a permanent trade center where businesses could go and hash out international deals. So it's basically like a trade show like we have here for construction or kitchen renovations or whatever. It was going to be a permanent world trade center. There was a similar one set up in New Orleans that was very nefarious as well and used by organized crime. This is exactly the same thing. It's called basically PERM, PERM for permanent, and then index or um, permadex is the way it's referred to as far as an acronym goes, where it was going to be, it was exposed originally, its existence was by New Orleans DA when he was investigating the assassination of JFK. And I'll go into that in just a second. So the Permadex, um, Basel, where it was originally set up, we read a lot about that. That's where, Alan Dulles, worked, some of the meetings with Galen, in the stay-behind units. It's also the Bank of International Settlements when we were talking about the third way, um, and that book where the Bank of International Settlements is the central bank for central bankers and a perfect way to launder money. So there's a lot of nefarious activity in Basel, and so there's no coincidence that with all of the international intrigue going on there that you would set Permidex up originally there, but later it gets moved to Rome. So back to the JFK thing. Permidex and the board of the Centro Mondial Comercial was to maintain an effective permanent World's Fair, a centralized site where businessmen could display their wares, deals could be made, and important corporations could maintain offices. Because, they have to have a place to be able to operate behind the scenes and under the radar. Permidex has been tied to various covert networks. When Garrison was on the trail of Permidex, um, the presence of Clay Shaw, an apparent CIA contract agent, was on the Permidex board. So, and we know probably the most interesting part of this, and it happened in 1960, let's see, 67 is when they talked about it, but the fact that Gladio was so into everything in Rome, them moving it to Rome and the money laundering that went on at the Vatican in support of Operation Gladio is probably huge as an overlay onto this book. We're going to have to keep our eye on that. All right. Italian journalist recovered a cache of the Centro Mondiale Commerciale. I'm just going to refer to that as CMC, which was a subsidiary of Permidex. She found a stash of corporate documents that showed that Permidex was plugged into the Italian state security apparatus. Also, a curious series of connections to Israel. One of the CMC founders, George Mandel, was affiliated with the Banque pour le Commerce Suisse Emirati Centrale, which was identified as having supplied cover employment for Israeli intelligence service agents. So you basically have now CMC founders giving employment to Israeli intel people located in Rome. Another director was linked to Mossad via the Swiss Israel Trade Bank. There you go. Another money laundering outfit. So Lewis Mortimer Bloomfield has often been described as the founder of Permidex and sometimes as its dominant shareholder. But Whitney says that's inaccurate because Bloomfield was Permidex attorney, that most of all of the Permidex ownership was hidden. He basically acted as the registered agent for all these people, and it was very murky who actually owned anything as it related to Permidex. He was the face of it all. So, with links to both Permidex, the world of intel, there were rumors about Bloomfield during the World War II being a member of the OSS, which would make perfect sense that they would be setting up Permidex to act as a cover for their operations throughout the world as a permanent trade fair place. So, a guy by the name of William Stevenson, who is a British spy master, who was also active in Canadian industry and finance, um, was also part of this uh, organization. And he says that Bloomfield held a membership in the Knights of Malta. I know Julie's going to love that one. Yeah. So the guy that's the shield for Permadex is a Knight of Malta. Gotta love that. Um, he also eventually becomes an attorney and president of the Orders Quebec Council for the Knights of Malta. Bloomfield also is attached to a number of Zionist organizations, to include the World Jewish Congress, and some Canadian branches of different ones, to include the Israel's trade union complex. So Bloomfield's connected to everything. Um, he has concerns in maritime commerce. He's the president of the Canadian wing of the Israeli Maritime League. Um, the uh, they have connections to the Jewish Agency and ZIM Shipping, uh, which is a key supplier of weapons and supplies to Israel from the Haganah days. Later, Bloomfield corresponds with George H.W. Bush, because of course he does, to include while he was the CIA director. The letters indicate that the two first met at a meeting in Canada's embassy in Beijing in 1975. It appears they had a long running fascination with China, the two of them. He gave public addresses calling for the normalization of relations in the country. Bloomfield's position on China predated Nixon's and Kissinger's by years. The prominent figure in touch with Bloomfield was Tiber Rosenbaum. Permadex documents show that Rosenbaum and his International Credit Bank were deeply involved in Permadex and the CMC. In 1961, a memo was written from Bloomfield to Rosenbaum discussing the adjacent project headed by CMC's founder, George Montello, called Marina Real. Marina Real was a holding company used by Permadex principals to acquire real estate. Now, isn't that interesting? Why would Permadex, who's just a trade entity, have a holding company to acquire real estate? Because Permadex was never just a trade exhibit. Bloomfield acted as a proxy for shareholders whose names remained unknown. The communication between him and Rosenbaum, however, identifies some of the other parties with interests in Marina Real. Among those is Dov Bagan, Biegun, a leading figure in the World Zionist Organization. He would go on to become the secretary of the National Committee for Labor Israel. Much like Bruce Rappaport and Robert Maxwell, Biegun, Began, I'm going with that, Began, spent World War II in the British Army. He served in the intelligence operations in France, Holland, and Norway. Another investor in Marina Real was Nate Dolan of Cleveland, Ohio. Dolan achieved notoriety in 1970 when a firm he was connected to, Realty Equities, ran a fraud scheme in conjunction with Rosenbaum's ICB. Dolan had a business relationship with Lansky connected mobster Dole DeLitz going back to the 40s when they both owned shares of the Cleveland Indians. There's other big names involved in Permadex, found in the Lewis Bloomfield's papers, show that his law partner, Stanley Weinberg, was keeping a close eye on developments. And there were cables from a French company that, let's see, said that by 1953, Francis Pioneer, a scion of the famed British banking family, the Edmund de Rothschilds, who exerted dominant control over the institution of this French company, a French finance company, was involved in all of this as well. Rothschild was also a business partner in Tiber Rosenbaum. The two had organized the Israel Corporation, an actual corporation called Israel Corporation, Israel's largest investment company. So the Rothschilds created with Tiber Rosenbaum the Israel Corporation, which is said to be the largest investment company in Israel. When it was discovered in 1974 that Rosenbaum had built the company to the tune of $60 million, the Israeli government linked up a small handful of countries' leading banks to participate in an effort to prevent its liquidation. Hmm. Rothschild appears all over Bloomfield's correspondence and was clearly intimately involved with Permadex. Bloomfield, one of the cables from Bloomfield to an Abraham Friedman at the Israeli Continental Oil Corporation in Tel Aviv requested that Friedman discuss matters relevant to the Italian real estate deals with Rothschild directly. Also, it let's see, it identifies Israel Continental Oil as having been set up in Canada in 1952, while the Canadian government records show that Louis Bloomfield's nephew, Bernard Bloomfield, was a director of the international credit bank subsidiary Atlas Bank when oh my god. So the um you just can't make this shit up. So again, she's expertly weaving the web of how all of these players are involved with each other in all of these banks and all of these companies. And they will set up companies in, for example, in this case, in Canada. And it's supposedly the Israeli Continental Oil. Um, and you have all of these banks and all of these people sit on the same board. So what I'm trying to do, and I went back to my Operation Gladio um, wiring diagram. I'm trying to put all of these names on that wiring diagram so that in the future, all we have to do is type in the search bar and we'll be able to put our clicker on there and it will show their network because I think that's going to be extremely important as we go forward. But it is a lot of work because there's a lot of names. This woman did so much research. It's such amazing um, bunch of information, which is why I wanted to share it with all of you. Okay, so a year after Israel's Continental Oil was founded, it became a player in a consortium of oil firms looking to drill. Y'all are going to be impressed with this near the Dead Sea and in all sections of Israel. Other partners were Husky Oil Company, which was affiliated with the mob linked Rim Rock Tidelands Oil Company. The new Continental Oil Company, with which Israel Continental Oil set up a joint venture with in Canada. The president of New Continental was Frank Kaftel, an organized crime associate and stock manipulator originally from Cleveland. And he was friends with the Nate Dolan that we just talked about. So, Capital also was identified by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics as being a close associate of Bayonne Joe um, Zaccarelli, mobster. So, is Israel really just a mob state? Is that what it is? Because that's what it sounded like. Tricontinental pipelines, where Edmund de Rothschild, Francis Perrier, and Louis Bloomfield could all be found. That's just crazy. The Tricontinental Company was part of a group that controlled a pipeline from Eilat to Hafra. The basis for the larger Trans-Israel pipeline that linked Israel to Iran, alongside the Miami Group and the Palestine Economic Cooperation, PEC. The Miami Group, as mentioned above, maintained ties to organized crime interests and also connected to the family of companies that were partnered with the Israel Continental Oil Corporation. PEC, on the other hand, was a primary conduit for investment of American capital into Israeli industries. So, talking about the PEC company, which is the Palestine Economic Corporation, what a name, described as the largest American private investor in Israel. So, not Palestine, Israel. An instrument through which American Jews could render material assistance to production enterprises in Palestine, not Palestine, Israel. In only the period from 1950 to 59, its capital increased 70%. PEC's assets totaled $19 billion in 1961 and had set up a whole network of companies and banks and agencies, all with tentacles throughout the Israeli economy. PEC linked with leading financial and industrial monopolies in the U.S. Wall Street banker Lehman Brothers, Kuhn, Loeb and Company, the Mellon Group of Pittsburgh, the Cabot Lodge Group of Boston, and the Hanna Group of Cleveland. This network was complex and convoluted, yet there was a clear Israel, Italy, France, Canada axis that was tied directly into hot money networks in the Caribbean, with flows of capital from the West to Israel itself and the outflows of raw material like diamonds from the Third World. So, there you have it. The more narrow case, this World Trade Center, the Permidex, it is clear how this World Trade Center would be of benefit to in what's the word? Engineering international capital flows and business arrangements of this very nature. So the CIA, the Italian Special Forces Services, and Mossad all involved in a World Trade Center that is basically using dark money laundered through mafia connections, all making investments throughout Israel. So Michelle Mehta, or I guess that's Mikkel, it's a guy, wrote a book on Permidex and noted that in 1960, special arrangements were made in Israel between Israel and Italy to support the OAS, the French paramilitary group in Algeria, in return for Italian oil companies getting access to Algerian crude. Now, this is very interesting because this says a whole lot. And this is just one sentence, but I want to explain something. OAS is the paramilitary assassins that were part of Operation Gladio in France that kept trying to kill de Gaulle. Two of them were in Dallas the day JFK was murdered, one of which was giving a ride to the Mexican border and dropped off on the Mexican side of the border to get him out of the country. Algeria is important because Algeria was the um, country that the paramilitary group did not want France to let go of because they wanted to control the country, the resources, but de Gaulle and JFK were on the side of giving Algeria their freedom. And now this author just links the Israel to this whole arrangement because the Italian oil companies wanted access to the Algerian crude. And they had a partnership with Israel as it relates to that. And so was the whole Algerian non-freedom movement linked to Israel? That's a question. Who was behind the fierce civil war mounted in Algeria, denying their freedom? And we were told when we looked into the connections of the OAS with JFK's assassination that on his way back to France, de Gaulle said that he was killed by a secret society. So I find that one paragraph right there so enlightening in as it relates to everything that we've learned about Operation Gladio. It's crazy how all of these things overlap each other. Okay, last page. So we've got, let's see, l- leading the negotiations with the Algerian, Italian, Israeli for access to Algeria's gas was former Italian Prime Minister Tramboni and his son-in-law Mekusi Kechi, who sat on the board of CMC. On the other side of the OAS, the negotiations were reportedly handled by the paramilitary leader, Jacques Cousteau. The particular angle emerged during the investigation into the mysterious death of Enrico Mattei. And remember, he's the Italian guy who was trying to help Algeria out and give them more of their money in a negotiated deal than what the other big oil companies were doing. And his plane blew up. Y'all remember talking about that? He was basically killed in an Operation Gladio operation in October 1962. So Whitney's talking about the mysterious death of Enrico Mattei. He was in he was the head of ENI, which was the large oil and gas firm in Italy that supplied petroleum to NATO and Sixth Fleet. Mattei had embarked on something of a different path than the old Cold War. He sought to sign oil agreements with the Soviet Union and with Algeria, an Egyptian interest, who at the time was opposed to Israel. Mattei's death is less than accidental, has the thought that his death was less than accidental has existed for decades, and we proved 100% that it was not accidental in our previous book. Italian journalist Bellini turned over information allegedly identifying the real culprits to one of those inquiries headed by a judicial magistrate by by the name of Vincenzo Calia, and he was one of the same guys that investigated Operation Gladio. He's quoted as saying, "I think to understand the death of Enrico Mattei, you need to follow the trail to Jacques Cousteau." It that name is Soustelle. This was the man given the job of doing Operation Mattei with around $100,000 from Montreal through Permadex. Now, do you know why Permadex was in Rome? So, what then were the connections to organized crime? One possibility is through its connection to Tiber Rosenbaum's International Credit Bank. Permadex CMC was involved with money laundering activities. Permadex, published by investigative an expose of Permadex, published by investigative journalist Ugazi in the now defunct paper, um, it says that a company called Italio American Hotel Corporation, IAHC, was identified as an affiliate of CMC, in other words, Permadex. The IAHC Permadex affiliate was dedicated to high-end real estate development in various locations in Rome. One of the big projects was Hotel du Lac, curiously located next to ENI's headquarters. In other words, they're building a hotel next to Matei's headquarters. Financing for this project came from Banca Nos- Nacion del Lavoro, or initials BNL, a bank that will be discovered in Chapter 7 with ties to BCCI, which is a criminal bank, and Banco Ambrosiano, which we all know is directly tied to Operation Gladio because that's where Calvi worked, who ended up hung on the bridge in London, and also played a role in the flow of weapons to Iraq in 1980. The money from BNL handled, however, came from a variety of other sources in Geneva and Liechtenstein. One of these sources was none other than ICB. While this is to be expected given Rosenbaum's numerous ties to Permadex, it does raise the questions about the ultimate provenance of this money, given that ICB was moving the laundered money being poured into its correspondent banks into the Caribbean. It is possible via these companies, this money was being put to use in Italian real estate ventures. And she acknowledges that that part is speculative, but it is very interesting, and she did a very good job of tying all of these people to intel, banking, and illicit activities, and naming some of the big highlighted entities that we can then use for the rest of this book. And the next one is going to be about Ray Cohn, Cohn. That's chapter 4, and what he referred to as the favor bank. Y'all are definitely going to want to be around for that because Ray Cohen has direct ties to Donald Trump, and there's a lot of speculation about those ties. And um, I had forgotten a lot about his background, until rereading this. Knew there were connections, and I know that Whitney Houston is not a big fan of Donald Trump's. So there's parts of this you're going to have to take with a grain of salt, but it is very interesting to read about him because there's a lot of overlap with things that are happening right now. So the next chapter is gonna be, as exciting as this one, but I'm I know, uh, I'm I'm dumbfounded. I'm hard to surprise at this point, but I'm dumbfounded at the ties that the beginning of Israel has to terrorism, to laundered money, to banks that um, process laundered money, and to people that were corrupt in every way. It's hard. I mean, you just can't unsee it at this point. So it is very interesting. So oh, Zim shipping was Bush. Oh, is that right? Dang it! I'm gonna have to write that one down. Hold on a second. I gotta go back and look at that one. I may need to look into that. Y'all are so smart. I'm telling you, I love working with all of you. Um, okay. Yeah, Knights of Malta. I'm shaking my head. Absolutely. And thank you for Julie for getting all the words or the names so people can go back and do their own research. I really, really appreciate that. These so I found another, and I don't want to recommend it because of the language that's involved. Not that we're all uh, soft or anything when it comes to language, but there isn't anything new, and the language is very off-putting in this video I was watching today. If there was new information, I definitely would recommend it regardless of the language, but, um, one of the funny things is, like, one of the guys has a very strong Southern, dialect and or accent, and he was talking about Operation Gladio in, Belgium about the Duveau, the child molester, gross, nasty thing, and I am gonna write an article about that, by the way, which is why I was doing this research. But he said as he's trying to say all the names of the people in Belgium, he's like, "Just screw it, I'm gonna, spell them because it is so hard to and when you say them wrong, you may miss the connection of the way we have normally heard it, like Helliwell, if you just called him Hellwell or whatever, or completely mispronounced it, somebody's going to gloss right over that and not realize it's the exact same guy. So I want to be very careful because connections matter, just like Liza just said about the Zim shipping. If we don't spell these names out for future reference for people to be able to go back and do their own research, we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot because this needs to be a collective effort. So, one last point. The reason why I'm going to do this article on the Belgium Dutro, um, while I was listening to this video, it occurred to me that the we understand the network, we understand the wagon wheel, and Julie, um, I know you sent that to me. I need to post that next time. I'm gonna make myself a note. She updated our little, wiring diagram of all of the different operations. So I need to put that, on the screen here next time. We've already, spent a lot of time here, so I don't wanna do it today. But when you look at the wagon wheel that goes from the opium fields. We got to be in a war to protect them. The war generates weapons that is then trafficked for money. The wars displace humans that are then trafficked for money. And it kind of just goes right around where you end up back at the beginning because then they have to move the field from whether it was Vietnam to the uh, Turkey, Iran area to South America or whatever. Wherever they move this wagon wheel, you have the same operations going on. So, with that in mind, I was listening to this podcast, and it doesn't matter whether you're talking about the Aquino guy that was the child abuser, a molester network on the military bases out at the Presidio, which, there's lots of foreign dignitaries that come into San Francisco, which is where this operation was. So you've got that child operation. We've got child trafficking operation. You've got the one for the Boys Town in Nebraska being shipped into the White House when George Sr. was the president. You've got Pizzagate, which is in DC, which has access to all of the political people that come to DC. You've got this Dubois guy who was in Belgium, where NATO and all of that other stuff, and the EU and everything with all of those politicians. All of those are connected. And we tend to focus on one when we're talking about one, and we don't see how it overlays into every hotspot of senior governmental locations, whether it's San Francisco or Belgium or Washington, D.C. or Rome, Italy. They all have these child trafficking networks. London had one. Um, and we're looking at them only as one entity and not the broader picture of how they totally go into um, the um, the whole network of this Gladio operation. And of course, we know that the politicians are blackmailed into not enacting um, legislation or enacting legislation that all goes back to the fascist beginning on the top of the pyramid to the round table. So again, we go back to the third way, communism, fascism, moving us into this middle direction. And the people are compromised by uh, blackmail. And we saw it at the beginning of this book with the Blue Suite in New York in the Plaza Hotel, with the claims that there was young um, boys in this case being made available to old nasty men. Again, in a place, New York City, which has the UN and all of the political dignitaries, resulting in one admiral killing himself as a result of it. So I think we need to push the conversation so that everybody understands this is all linked together. So I'm going to write an article that's going to kind of highlight. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in the Pizzagate one because Liz Crokin obviously has done that way better than I could ever do it. We all are aware of the Satan aspect of the Aquino one out in San Francisco. So I'm going to briefly mention them at the beginning. The one that most people don't know, and it's the grossest one of all, is the one in Belgium that we went over in our Operation Gladio book. So I am going to write a article that kind of brings in a couple of pieces and overlays them on top of each other so we can see that it's applicable and how it fits into everything. So yes, I gotcha, Zapata. Yeah, we talked about the Zapata oil. As a matter of fact, I just mentioned that to somebody um, who had made the comment. I think it was Joe Lang that had talked about the bushes, and he had talked about Zapata oil, but he did not know about the Zapata Cuba and the fact that there had been oil found there off the coast of Cuba, and that the Zapata oil had been created within 12 months of the finding of that oil, thinking that they were going to get Cuba back and that the Zapata oil was going to be extracting oil from Zapata, Cuba. Um, Surprise, that didn't happen. But yeah, so appreciate y'all being here. That's all I got for today. I'll publish the schedule either tonight or tomorrow for next week and the rest of our book reviews. Again, thank you very much for being here. I appreciate it. Oh, make sure that you like, give us a thumbs up, and that you share this. And that God bless you, Julie. I should say that right up front, for getting all the followers on here yesterday. You are an amazing, amazing wingman, and I really appreciate you being here. So Thank you again from the bottom of my heart. The more people that hear this, the more eyes we get on this, is so important. And again, I can't thank you enough, Julie, for being there with your two wonderful kids, helping me behind the scenes as much as you do. So thank you all. And I will see you next time. Chapter 4.